spends a lot of time on are the economic problems of Mexico in the 19th century. And she finds the root of those economic problems in the destructiveness of the War of Independence. That is, from 1810 to 1821, Mexico will be ravaged by a decade of incredible violence, with particular destruction of the economic foundations of the country at that time, or at that time still a colony in that regard. So Mexico comes out of the wars of independence basically independent, but in an economic sense completely devastated by that war of independence, and struggles for all of the 19th century to try to catch up, to try to remedy that long, long, long history of being an economic colony of Spain and the consequences of its independence in an economic sense. Another point that Josefina mentions is the cultural divide in Mexico. A cultural divide that is compounded by the political divide that I just mentioned. Liberals were particularly focused on, in a sense, taking the teeth out of the influence, if you want to put it that way, of the Catholic Church. So that the Catholic Church, as a political institution, was also an important cultural institution. As I suspect all of you know, and especially if you're Catholic, Catholic theology is not a very revolutionary theology. Obedience, obedience, obedience. So the Catholic Church in that sense was not just a cultural institution, but a fundamental political institution reinforcing Spanish rule, and then subsequently the rule of conservatives who wanted to conserve that political order to a large extent inherited from the colonial class. The liberals wanted to dismantle that political order and put secular government in front, as opposed to having the Catholic Church as one of the main supporters of the political regime, which would have been the case with the conservatives in that respect. And then lastly, although not necessarily least important in Josefina's interpretation, are the social divisions. And these social divisions were not just of class, which were of course very important, but they were also racialized social divisions. Divisions inherited by that long, again, 300 years of history in which Mexico established a social hierarchy with people of what we would call nowadays people of color at the lower echelons of that social hierarchy, and those that were considered white at the upper end of that social hierarchy. And those social divisions were deep and widespread. After 300 years of colonialism, you were not going to, in a sense, get rid of that residue very quickly. And that residue was reflected in the social divisions in Mexico. So when you had a general come into a village and say something, "Muchachos, tenemos que pelear con los norteamericanos," it is quite likely that for those who were primarily Indian, those who were of mixed racial background and who were poor and so on, were likely to tell that general, "A tu madre." We're not going to go. All right, so they had to be conscripted, they had to be drafted, they had to be forced to join the army. And Josefina again very briefly mentions it, but at various moments in time, during the Texas Revolt of 1836, and again during the war itself, over and over again, the Mexican armies were decimated before they even got to the battlefield because of the high rates of desertion. When those people got a chance, they were out of there. Why? If for no other reason, there was no sense of loyalty to this abstraction called Mexico. Because for a lot of people, that's exactly what it was. It was an abstraction. Just like for the Californios, if you stop and think about it, up until 1820 or so, they were Spanish subjects. And then a ship comes by and says, "Hey, we don't belong to Spain anymore. You belong to Mexico." And a lot of the Californios said something like, "The hell is that?" sort of thing. Because of that disconnect between what was going on in the center and what was going on in the periphery at that time of Spain, and then later the Mexican periphery, which went all the way from what we now call basically Brownsville, all the way over to San Francisco and everything in between. So in that respect, Josefina talks about all of these different factors, but then she complicates the story when she emphasizes the role of foreign relations and foreign powers. And she particularly focuses on the role of Great Britain, because if there was one break, in a sense, that could be exercised against American expansionism, it was Great Britain. And she mentions in her story the significance of the agreement over Oregon. If you read it carefully, you will notice that Great Britain told Mexico, sign the agreement, give up Texas, do not give up California, but give up Texas, avoid war. Well, why would Great Britain care? And in that sense, Josefina obviously is emphasizing the fact that Great Britain had interest in Latin America and in Mexico specifically, but it did not have the means necessarily to intervene militarily in what was beginning to be the signs, or all the signs pointed, the beginning of eventually a war between the United States and Mexico. Britain did not want a war between the United States and Mexico. Not because it loved the United States, not because it loved Mexico, but because of its economic and other kinds of interests. Great Britain, and those of you who might have heard my talk, I think it was a couple of years ago, I emphasized that Great Britain had its hands full in the 1840s and didn't want to, in a sense, get involved in another foreign adventure, if you will. It had its hands full with China, the Opium War, had its hands full with problems at home, the reform laws, the corn laws, etc., in the 1830s, early 1840s, and so on. So it didn't want to get involved in another war or another kind of conflict, parentheses, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. So if we're having doubts about whether we should be in Libya, you can imagine then the Brits were also concerned about getting involved again somewhere else in the world and having to take on the United States either directly or indirectly. But Britain was concerned about the U.S. having ports on the Pacific and beginning to muscle in a sense, in their interest in Asia. The Brits were very, very protective of that sphere, if you will, of the world. That's why Josefina then complicates the story by telling us at various moments in time what is going on internationally, particularly in the case of Great Britain in terms of its role in a sense. Domestic politics in the United States, but for Josefina, a key issue in the domestic politics in the United States is a question of slavery, which is her way of connecting the question of Texas and the whole question of slavery with the larger question of slavery in the United States. And as all of us know who teach American history and so on, in the past, in the old days, we used to talk about the U.S.-Mexican War primarily as part of the prelude leading up to the Civil War. And if it wasn't for the Compromise of 1850, maybe the Civil War would have started more or less around that time. Okay? So in that respect, the issue of slavery is an important part of the story for Josefina, not only in terms of the specific conditions in Texas, but because it invites a question. What is going on in the United States politically that permits, that leads to the willingness of the United States to participate in a conflict with Mexico? But the bottom line is this. What makes Mexico so vulnerable in the middle of the 19th century? We all know, those of us who might recall our high school days and so on, and some of you who teach, there's occasionally fisticuffs on our campus, right? In high schools. So some more than others. But eventually there's a fight. Well, anybody who's ever been in a fist fight, you know that one of the first things you have to ask yourself, do I have a chance of winning? Sort of thing. So if you think you might have a chance, you're more likely to be aggressive, right? Push back, and this sort of thing. If on the other hand, I'm 5'8", 155, 160 pounds, and someone gets in front of me at a theater and so on, in the long line for Transformers, right? It starts Wednesday. But it's this big thing right now about how it's going to start showing at midnight on Wednesday or something. Right? Well, if that person is 270 pounds and has a six-pack, and I'm not talking about one of these, all right, that you can literally see through his tight-fitting T-shirt, and he's about 2% body fat, all right, and he can crack walnuts in a sense with his biceps. Am I going to take that guy on? No. All right. So what was it about Mexico that led the United States to be increasingly aggressive, to be willing to push and push again and push again? Obviously, one of the interpretive flaws, I think, in Josefina's analysis is that the United States began to realize very quickly that Mexico was not in a position to defend itself against an assertive power like the United States. The United States wanted to buy itself into what we now call the western part of the United States. It wanted to buy first Texas, and she mentions that briefly. And those of us who teach California history, you know that California was coveted by various U.S. Presidents in the past, including Polk, and they tried to buy it, etc. And the Mexicans refused for a variety of different reasons. The important point is, at some juncture, U.S. leaders, political leaders said, yes, we can take them on. We can take them on. It wasn't about artillery. It wasn't about an officer corps. It wasn't about discipline in the ranks and so on. Because you can have discipline in the ranks. You can have artillery all you want, right? Take boxing lessons. I grew up taking boxing lessons and so on. But despite my boxing lessons, am I going to take someone who weighs 270 pounds and cracks walnuts with his biceps? I don't think so, all right? Because they would just kind of bounce off of him and then he'd squeeze my head a little bit, pick me up, and say, do you want to do this anymore? Probably not, all right? In that respect, prior to 1836, the fact that Mexico had to try to colonize Texas with Americans already tells us about the weaknesses of Mexico. And those people, word of mouth, right? Oh, and she mentions it, right? The cheap land that was available and so forth and so on. But equally important is the fact that people could go back and forth across that border almost with impunity. There was no homeland security. Right? There was no border patrol, there were no walls, there were no drones, and so on along. People were just going back and forth all of the time. Right? Another element is the inability of Mexican authorities to enforce their own laws. That became clear very early on after Mexico reaches its independence. By the middle 1820s, again, many people were evading Mexican law. She makes a big deal about how people like Austin and so on had to swear allegiance to Mexico and so forth and so on, and then immediately turn around, who cares, right? It's kind of like going to confession on Sunday and saying to the priest, I'm never going to do this again and so on, and then by Tuesday you have to go to confession already, all right, sort of thing. Okay, maybe not you guys, but that was my in the Texas Revolt of 1836, the only reason why we didn't annex it, you all know, because it would exacerbate the whole question of slavery in the territories. So for 10 years, Texas was an independent republic. Right? That's why the Dallas Cowboys have that silly star on their helmet. Right? So that again told the United States of Mexico's weakness, the inability of Mexico to retake Texas in that respect. 1836. Then in 1838, France intervenes in Mexico, takes over the custom house and the main port of Mexico for several months, and extracts from Mexico a huge payment for the alleged damages done to French businesses and French citizens and so on during the wars of independence. Great Britain was going to get involved but said, it's not worth it and so on. our Navy has other things to do. And so it was the French who ended up, in that respect, making some money off that. But what did that tell outsiders? Again, Mexico was not in a position to defend itself from, in this case, an outside force that had to send ships all the way from France, had a very long line of supply. There was no Haiti available to them any longer, and this sort of thing. So the French fleet, in that respect, had a very long distance to go to maintain itself, and yet it easily was able not only to intervene and occupy the main port, but stay there, and probably could have stayed there indefinitely, given the weakness of the Mexican military and Mexican authorities and the like. A third event that indicated the weakness of Mexico, and that was the willingness, and she talks about who some of these characters were, the willingness of Mexican leaders to entertain the possibility of selling Texas, to entertain the possibility of finding a way of exchanging Texas, Texas claims with an agreement with the United States. And so in the reading, note the whole question of where would be the border between Texas and Mexico. The Mexicans claim what we call the Rio Grande. In Mexican maps, it's called the Rio Bravo, as opposed to the Nueces River, which is much further north of the current border between the United States and Mexico. And the fact that the Mexicans could not defend that area from U.S. U.S. settlers coming in, we would call them squatters in other days, and this sort of thing, that indicated clearly that, again, Mexico was not in a position to enforce its own borders in that respect. So when the Mexicans established for the first time a customs house to collect taxes of goods coming in into Texas and so on, that issue would percolate continuously, in part because of the inability of Mexico to collect those taxes. It's kind of like the fast track. As some of you know, some people, they don't have fast track, but they go right through there. And one of the reasons they do that is by the time the camera takes a picture, by the time it gets to the appropriate office, by the time you get the notification and so on, weeks can go by. And oftentimes, well, I wasn't driving that day, that was my cousin, that was my uncle, he didn't know, or something like that. And oftentimes those fines go uncollected, as opposed to Berkeley parking meters. That's another story. They're out there, I mean, they hide, I swear. That thing comes up, and they are there 30 seconds later. I mean, they are quick in that respect. All of these are signs of Mexico's weakness. And initially, it was misread. It was misread in the sense that U.S. authorities pushed hard to buy Texas and then eventually California. And in that regard, leading up to James Polk and so on, they could not believe that the Mexicans wouldn't sell. Look, no one is there. Most of the people are our people anyway. You say there's no slavery, but your own government is unwilling to take on the Texans in terms of enforcing the no slavery rule that you have passed since 1824. So you know you can't defend this territory. You even gave the Texans an exemption in terms of the no slavery rule in your own constitution. So what's the deal? That clearly shows you are unable to, in a sense, defend and hold this territory that you claim for Mexico. Polk runs out of patience, and we have the war. And I suspect all of you know the details in that respect. And it seems to me that Josefina could have given much more attention to the signs of that weakness that were read by the United States in such a way that it became increasingly aggressive in its relations with Mexico. All those other factors clearly played a role in that respect. The political, the economic, the social divisions, and the like. Now, if I was a military historian, I would probably emphasize the economic and the social. Economic because you need the money to have the cavalry, to have the horses, to have the artillery, to have the ammunition. Those of you who saw the PBS special on the U.S.-Mexican War, you know that at the very end in the Battle of Mexico City and so on, some of the Mexican muskets, they tried to round off pebbles to make them round enough to put it in the breech in order to fire the rifles. That's how bad it was. All right? Antiquated artillery, officers who were very badly trained, an army that at any given moment would desert, and so on. So the economic conditions are clearly critical in that regard. Mexico had no navy to speak of. It was a joke in that respect. So how was it going to defend any kind of invasion, if you will, from the ocean, whether it's Pacific or the Gulf? And again, the reading indicates what happened here in California in that regard. I'm going to leave time for Q&A. Last point, in terms of the economic. Most soldiers like to get paid. And in that respect, without the economic wherewithal to pay the soldiers, then what was going to happen to the families of those soldiers? One of the reasons you had such a high rate of desertion in the Mexican army is people had to go home and take care of the crops and so on in order to feed their families. And if you weren't going to pay them, they were definitely going to be gone in that respect. Now, the other is the social divisions. No sense of loyalty, no sense of unity, no sense of allegiance to this thing called Mexico. And in that sense, those social divisions, I think, are particularly fundamental in understanding the weakness of Mexico vis-a-vis the United States. Mexican historiography tends to underestimate the significance of those social divisions, in part because Mexico has always prided itself as being a raceless society. And of course, it is not. This is among the reasons why my colleague Brian DeLay has made it an important contribution to the historiography. Talk about the Indians in Mexico and their relationship to the Mexican government and their role then in the U.S.-Mexican War. And again, at various, it's usually in one sentence, Josefina acknowledges the significance of Indians, for example, in the northern part of Mexico and so on, but it glosses over a very important chapter in that regard. And that is the long-standing animosities, the long-standing tensions between Mexico as a government and its indigenous population in the south, in the central, and in the north. Clearly the north important here in terms of the story regarding, say, Texas, what we now call New Mexico, Arizona, and of course California, in that regard. Because the path of invasion had to go through territory that was to a large extent unsettled because of the role of indigenous defenders, if you will, against the Mexican government, Mexican settlers who were encroaching, quote unquote, on their ancestral lands in that respect. So Brian, in this regard, is going, I'm sure, illuminate that particular part of the story. Let me stop now and answer any questions. In my interpretation of the war, etc., as you can imagine with my last 2 minutes or so of my presentation, those are the elements that I particularly emphasize in my particular interpretation of the war. When Josefina was here as a visiting professor, she came to hear my talk, and we had a dispute for, I don't know, at least a week of friendliness. I respect her greatly, and we get along fine at a personal level, but we had clashing swords, in a sense, in terms of how we interpreted the U.S.-Mexican War, when it came especially to those 2 elements that I just mentioned in that respect. So I think we have until about 10:15. Is that correct?
Actually, not until 10:30.
10:30. All right. Well, let me tell you. No. Let me stop here, and if we run out of questions and so on, then I'll maybe emphasize a couple of the other points in that respect. I thought 10:15. I apologize. I was looking at the clock, and I like to keep Q&A as long as I can. Yes. First name, please.
Denise.
Denise.
I mean, to me, as all this is unfolding, it just brings to mind the risk game. Are you familiar with it? It's a board game, and you get to put all your little pieces out. Mexico just seemed, I don't know how to put it. it was overstretched. There was no way they could control all this to begin with. I mean, the way it was set up. I mean,
Well, yes and no. I mean, at one level, the colonial legacies, one of the most important was simply geography. Right? It stretched all the way from what we now call Guatemala, all the way to California, north and south, and of course east and west, as I said, all the way to the edges of what we now call Texas, all the way over to the Pacific coast, all along that very long Pacific coast where the Spanish Navy basically didn't exist, and so on. So Mexico, as I said, got its independence, but it was saddled with all of these huge
it's the geography.
questions, problems, etc. Not to mention just the geographic challenge of policing this humongous, and then the Mexicans even tried to extend it further. The first country to invade what we now call Guatemala was the Mexican army, because they tried to keep what we now call Guatemala. Because the Guatemalans, for their own reasons, and if you want, we can talk about those, didn't want to be part of the ex-colony New Spain, wanted to have its own independent nation in that respect.
That's the thing. I mean, I can see them heading south, but I mean, you've got the Sonoran Desert. I mean, that's no place. You can't settle it.
And
you
again,
can't
a colonial
control
legacy.
it.
Right? The Spanish government deliberately inhibited settlement in the northern reaches of its empire in the same way that it inhibits settlement in the southern reaches of its empire, like Argentina and Chile. Similarly, very sparsely inhabited. The advantage for Chile and Argentina is that it wasn't next door to an aggressive colonial power. Right? It was next door to Brazil and Portugal, this tiny little town. Portugal was so bad in a sense, militarily, that its royal family had to move to Brazil in order to avoid being occupied first by the French and eventually by the Spaniards again in that regard. But the Portuguese were not about to take Argentina because they saw the opportunity to do so, given Spain's weaknesses in that respect.
But what I think I'm trying to get to is I don't understand. I mean, you're saying that Spain was inhibiting
Settlement
the
for
settlement.
300 years, basically.
Yeah, but I mean, basically all they could handle would be the coast of California anyway, just from the geography of it. I mean,
Well, sure.
you know.
Sure.
So
if you can't police
So who wants
your
it?
borders,
Why?
then you invite other people to start taking pieces of it in that respect. It turned out to be the United States. It could have been France. It could have been Britain in that regard. It turned out to be primarily the U.S., mainly because of events in Europe. If Europe would have gone through a long period of peace, in a manner of speaking, undoubtedly the French and the Brits would have started to take pieces of what we now call Latin America in general, which they already had pieces of anyway in that regard. But it wasn't. It was a period of a great deal of disarray, disorder, violence, wars, and so on for much of the 19th century in that regard, beginning with the Napoleonic Wars in that regard. Yes.
Joe, so I'm not clear, why did the Spanish inhibit settlement?
The Quinto Real. The Quinto Real was 1/5. All of the wealth discovered in the New World, right off the top, the king got his 20%. Well, when the Spaniards found gold and silver by the 1540s, and they found humongous amounts of silver. 4/5 or so of the world's silver supply for about 100 years came from one place, and that was the mines of what we now call Mexico. All right? So that was the ache. Now, we all know when gold was discovered in California, what happened? All kinds of people came here.
Right.
Now, if you were the king and you got a 5th right off the top, are you going to allow everybody and their grandmother to look for gold and silver in the New World? Probably not, because inevitably, even though you're supposed to be a loyal Spanish subject and you're mining somewhere in, let us say, the foothills of the Sierra, right, and you find all this gold, where is the king? He's nowhere. Okay, you send one guy to inspect or oversee, but first name, Paul, right? Well, you can tell by Paul, he would easily sell out the king. But Joe would say, Paul, the king's over there in Madrid.
Right.
We are 6,000 miles away, all right? I keep 50%, you keep 50%. Who's supposed to know? That's why the Spanish kings especially after they found that wealth, they were going to control migration as a means of controlling the funneling of that wealth into the coffers of the Spanish monarchy. So they were not interested in developing an agricultural colony, right, to produce wheat and corn and this sort of thing for export to world markets. Even if they would have wanted to, of course, logistical problems would have gotten in the way.
So therefore, what was the value of this uninhabited land?
It had no value. That's why it was virtually unsettled. As far as the Spanish kings, it had no value. And finally, when they saw the encroachment begin to occur in the late or in the middle of the 18th century, that's when they sent poor Father Serra, limping up from Baja California into Alta California to establish what they had hoped to be eventually a colony that would be a source of defense of anybody trying to encroach upon it. But as Denise mentioned, the Spanish Navy, give me a break. Right? There was no way they were going to patrol all the way from the Oregon Territory down to Central America in that respect, not to mention the Pacific side, the Atlantic side, pardon me, in that respect. So much of the colonial legacy has to do as a function of Spain's weaknesses. Spain's weaknesses were translated in, for example, the lack of settlement in the northern periphery of the Spanish Empire. And in that sense, those Spanish policies had a long-standing consequence. And that's why Josefina begins her essay with the Bourbon reforms, which are in the middle of the 18th century, all right, which tried to correct some of these things, but by making the correction, it also invited a great deal of resistance, anger, and tensions among the settlers in that respect. In the back, yes?
My name is Jay, and you were talking about how Spain viewed Mexico as a source of wealth from metals and things. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that Mexico emerged from independence shattered by war. What also was the impact of the fact that for many years Spaniards required Mexicans to only make products for sale to Spain?
That was part of the economic weakness, right? That is, it was a deliberate policy to benefit Spanish producers of various goods. In this respect, then, industry in what we now call Mexico was inhibited again by Spanish policies in terms of its development and so on. So that candelabra, which easily could, just to pick an example, which easily could have been made in Mexico, had to be brought in from Spain. And in that respect, then, prices were very high. You can imagine the pricing, in a sense, taking something all the way from, say, Toledo all the way to Guadalajara, and all of the stops and etc., transportation fees and costs, etc. So things were very expensive in what we now call Mexico. This is one of the reasons why trade, illegal trade, took place again a great deal in the northern part of Mexico, leading eventually to what became known as the Santa Fe Trail, because Spanish settlers in the northern periphery of New Spain, and then later the northern periphery of Mexico, could get things a whole lot cheaper coming from St. Louis via New Orleans and Mississippi, etc., into what we now call New Mexico, a whole lot cheaper than having them come from Cádiz all the way through Veracruz, up Mexico by wagon train and so on, eventually get to places like what we now call Chihuahua City, or what we now call El Paso del Norte, etc. No comparison in that respect. And so you had a thriving illicit trade along what we now call the U.S.-Mexican border, in part, again, because of colonial policies and the inability and or unwillingness of Spanish authorities to realize that they couldn't control much of their empire, given the resources that they had. With greater resources, maybe they would have, but they would much rather have gold and silver chalices in Sevilla than have an effective number of forts along the borderline between what was then the United States and what was then the Spanish Empire. That they were not unwilling to invest, and when they did, it was too little and in effect too late. Okay. Let's see.
I think you just answered my question. I was going to ask, what prevented Spain from using the other 80% of the gold to invest in their army and their navy to protect their interest. It would seem like more in their self-interest to do that.
Well, how should I say this? The Spaniards used a lot of that wealth for themselves, obviously. A lot of that wealth, just like a lot of our wealth, ends up somewhere else, like called China, all right? As all of us know, right? We have this huge debt. In the same way, Spain bought everything that it needed using that gold and silver. And economic historians of Spain say one of the worst things that happened to Spain's history of industrialism and so on is that it had wealth too easy. And so rather than building factories and so on, they just found it easier to go buy the shoes from what we now call Holland, to buy nice leather products and so on from what we now call Italy, etc., rather than developing its own industry and manufacturing and the like. So they would commission ships to be made by other countries rather than having the ships being made in Spain itself. If you go to the Maritime Museum in Barcelona, you'll see how the ship works and this sort of thing in Barcelona and so on went through a decline at the beginning of the colonial period because the Spanish monarchy just found it so much easier to have the boats made somewhere else rather than being made in their own country in that regard. So industry, manufacturing, again, was underserved by that wealth. And a lot of that wealth was highly concentrated into guilds. So guilds of merchants had a monopoly over that trade, and the king would sell that monopoly. And it would end up in the hands of that very small number of merchants, for example. Obviously, a lot of it was used to pay off the nobility in that respect. And you got to keep in mind, Spain had a huge empire in Europe. It just wasn't the Iberian Peninsula. There were such things as the Spanish Netherlands. They controlled various parts of what we now call Italy. They had relations with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and then up until around the middle of the 17th century, they spent a lot of that money trying to suppress Protestantism. So a lot of that money went into wars in other parts of Europe. And in 1648, finally the Spanish kings told the Vatican, okay, we try to suppress this movement, our treasury is almost bankrupt, etc. We are not going to go to war anymore over this issue. But for roughly 100 years, in that respect, a lot of Spain's wealth was expended in defense of Catholicism in what eventually became Protestant Europe, or pockets of Protestant Europe in that regard. Okay, so that's a 4-minute answer to a very complicated question in that regard. Okay, now I usually go to my left, Jeff, but one of these few times I'm going to go to my right. Okay, the gentleman in the black shirt.
I went to Mexico City a couple years ago, and I had the good fortune of meeting an anthropologist who took me around to all these things, and I was constantly pressing him about social divisions, cultural divisions, race divisions, and various kinds of stratification and conflicts, and he refused to hear any of it.
Right.
And I was wondering how pervasive that myth of
Racelessness.
yes.
Very, very pervasive. Very pervasive. This is a very difficult thing for Mexican intellectuals to admit. They're more than willing to admit to class divisions, class differences, and so on. But racial, ethnic divisions, which of course is, in many respects, an oxymoron in that respect. I mean, there was a major rebellion in 1994 in Chiapas. It was indigenous-based, and if there was any doubt that there are still those kinds of tensions in Mexican society, you would think that this generation would certainly be aware of them, etc. Mexico has always prided itself on this notion of integrationism, going back to the notion that they would not establish reservations for their indigenous population. They didn't believe in this concept of the separation of the two communities, where indigenous people were considered to be sovereign nations, the Removal Act, all those kind of things that we kind of take for granted in our history and so on. The Mexicans would never acknowledge that indigenous people were not part of this big project of integrating the society. And this was very important to the Constitution of 1824, very important to the Constitution of 1856. These are two key constitutional historical moments in Mexico, and very importantly in the Constitution of 1917, in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. Over and over again, that theme was considered to be absolutely foundational in terms of the formation of the Mexican nation. And as I said, to this day, many Mexican intellectuals are unwilling to conceive the significance of those divisions. Oh yeah, we have, there are differences in Indians and Mexicans, but it's no big deal, right? Is the basic story that you heard, and it's the story you hear a lot, even among very well-educated Mexican intellectuals and so on. Oh, but much more important are class differences, or much more important are other regional differences or political differences. In that sense, there is still an unwillingness to accord the significance of that issue as much, at least in my opinion, that should be the case in understanding Mexican history and contemporary Mexican society. Now I go to my left, Jeff.
I have a political question. You mentioned the differences between the Federalists and the Centralists, and I've always found it convenient to teach my students in American history that the Texans were focused on states' rights in a similar way in which the Southerners are going to be a generation later,
Right.
and that Santa Anna was more of a centralist, and he wanted to assert control of a central government over the Texans when he took power. How accurate is that, or am I just doing that because it's convenient for
Well, first of
my
all, let's
interpretation?
give it to Santana. Because I come from that generation of taking my first Latin American history class, and I always remember that textbook when it came to Mexico in the 19th century. They called it the Age of Santana, all right? As if Santana, in one way or another, kind of caused or was responsible for all of that stuff that happened in the 19th century. Well, I found out later, the only reason why they put Santana there, because it was a convenient way to find a way of explaining, if you pardon the expression, what the hell was going on in Mexico. Here's a country that goes through over 40 changes in government in about a 30-year period. And at one of those characters that goes in and out of office will be Santana. All right? Santana was an opportunist. He was neither a centralist nor was he a federalist. All right? Santana was about Santana. Show me the money and I become a centralist. Show me the money, I become a liberal. Santana in that sense was an opportunist. So Santana in that respect is a symptom of that political struggle that you mentioned at the very beginning of your commentary. The centralists tended to be conservatives. So you have the centralist / conservative faction on one side, and the liberals and states' rights groups on the other. Now the liberals were those people who were obviously in reaction to that long history of colonialism. Everything was centralized, everything was focused in Mexico City, very little attention to the periphery of the country, or at that point the colony, and so on. So the liberals in that sense wanted to break down the centralization of that authority and everything that went along with it, including the role of the Catholic Church in supporting that very centralized notion of authority during the colonial period. So that's why they emphasized states' rights, to lessen the primacy and the centralization of power that was incarnated or embodied in the form of Mexico City and all the institutions, etc., that were attached to the city during the colonial period. The centralists in that respect wanted to retain that power. And because the centralists tended to be the elites in Mexico, they were even more bent in making sure that they maintained not only political influence, but economic influence, social influence, and even cultural influence in that respect. So regional elites resented the power of those merchants and those politicians and so on that were in the center of the country. So the conflict of states' rights versus the rights of the federal government and so on is, in that respect, extremely accurate. And making that comparison with the United States is very helpful, I think, for students to understand those distinctions. The difference in Mexico is that those distinctions between liberals and conservatives, etc., and states' rights the issue of slavery never became that important, except in the case of Texas. But outside of Texas, the issue of slavery was not at the core, or one of the core issues between states' rights and federalists, and those who wanted a strong central government, a strong union, if you will. So in that sense, that issue in the United States, in a sense, became, as I said, became focused over the question of slavery in that regard. Not the case in Mexico. There were other things, and I don't like to talk a lot about this because, again, a very complicated issue. Rather than slavery, it was the role of the church that became one of the core questions in the conflict between Federalists and Centralists. The Centralists wanted to maintain the Catholic institution, the Catholicism, not only as a strong cultural institution, but equally and more importantly, an important political and economic institution. If there was one place that you could go get some money in the aftermath of the devastation of independence, it was to the Catholic Church. Because no matter how poor you were, every Sunday you gave a little bit to the till of the church in that respect. It was the only place you could find liquidity, in a sense, in that respect. The liberals knew that, and if they wanted to build a government, they needed the money. The institution that had the money was the Catholic Church on a weekly basis. Maybe not a lot, but after Sunday Mass, there was some money there to be taken in that regard. The Centralists knew that if that money got into the hands of the liberals, who would they use that money against? Them. So in that sense, the Catholic Church became one of those core issues in the conflict between liberals and conservatives, in the same way that slavery became one of the core issues in the conflict between those who wanted strong states' rights and those that wanted a measure of federal power and authority in the case of the United States.
Jane McCoy. Would you say that the issue of race and the reluctance to admit these issues is also based on the fight for independence to begin with, that it had been inspired by the American Revolution, the concepts of equality and liberty were infused in that, and that America supported the Mexican fight for independence because we saw it as a takeoff on our own, and that the fear of Americans was relatively low at the time that Spain and then later Mexico began to invite Americans into eastern Texas.
Those of you who heard my talk on this before, I apologize for being somewhat repetitive. The struggle for independence in Mexico began as a caste war. When Father Hidalgo raised the standard for independence, the people who followed him were not following him for political principles. That is, liberty, democracy, freedom. Those kinds of principles were not the language, if you will, of their willingness to challenge Spanish authority. What they were particularly concerned about was the ways in which they were treated socially and how their social treatment translated itself into a lack of economic mobility, into a lack of political expression. And that's why the Hidalgo movement scared the holy bejesus, not only of Spanish authorities, but all of those Mexico-born, those of Spanish descent, what we would call whites. It scared even those whites who originally were inspired by the American Revolution, the so-called criollos. They were the ones who were politically inspired by the struggle for independence in the 13 colonies and wanted Mexican independence, but they did not want an inversion of the social order that had existed during the colonial period. So when Hidalgo riles up the castas, as they were called, people of mixed racial background, Africans, Indians, Spaniards, and mixtures thereof, and those of you who might recall my lecture on the casta system and so on, those were the people who, when they rose up, they were much more interested in redress of that long history of racialized relations in the colonial. So when Hidalgo says que mueran los cachupines, death to the Spaniards. That they understood. Not freedom, liberty, fraternity, and so on. That they understood. All right. And when they got to Guanajuato, a few weeks later, of September the 15th and so on, all of that rage that had been building for 300 years against being called indios, negros, morenos, etc., all those bad words, because they were of the castas group, or castas as they were called, then you had basically the massacre of all of the Spaniards in Guanajuato, a major colonial city, the major city where silver was minted into coins, and in that sense was a collection point for all that gold and silver, mainly silver, in north central Mexico and so on. And there's a wonderful book by Lucas Alamán, who's in your reading because he ended up being foreign minister of Mexico at various times and so on. And he was just 16, if I recall, and he wrote what he saw. And it's a gruesome passage, but the mutilation of the bodies of the Spaniards and so forth, and anyone who was white in that context, if you will, was killed. Women, men, children, didn't matter, because all that rage, all that anger, in a sense, was expended in this kind of spasm of violence and so on. That scared even Hidalgo. So when he got to the edges of Mexico City at this time is a city of 300,000 or 400,000 people. Imagine the carnage. And he had this army more than willing, with very few muskets, very few horses and so on, with still picks and axes and knives, machetes and so on. They were willing to invade, if you will, Mexico City and just wipe out, to the extent possible, those Spaniards, if you will. And Hidalgo realized the incredible bloodbath that would probably occasion, and he turned back to his eventual immediate death, as it turned out a few months later, in that respect. And when I give that talk in Mexico and this sort of thing, I always get a reaction from the Mexicans. Oh, you're overplaying the racial issue and so on, and this sort of thing. And I said, well, explain Guanajuato to me then. Why did that happen? Why the mutilization of the body? Well, then I go through another litany of historical events. Morelos, the other leader, when he pronounces the manifesto for independence, because he takes over the movement for Hidalgo and so on, what are three of the most important provisions in his siete leyes, as it's called? One was the abolishment of slavery, way back in 1812. The abolishment of the caste system. And third, that all Mexicans should be treated equally. Those are three fundamental provisions that talk to this. So why did he make it such a big deal? And the Mexicans, usually there's an embarrassed silence. And then before they can even say anything else, Chiapas, 1994.
Yeah.
All right, give me a break. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the question of trade, USF had an interesting exhibit a few months ago on the trade under Spanish times from west coast of Mexico to Manila and then with China and then back.
The Manila galleon trade.
Yes, I was wondering, did Mexico continue to profit from that after the revolution? And if Mexico did, would it be concerned about losing its California ports leading up to the Mexican War?
Mexico did not. Another Spanish policy. Another Spanish policy was to prohibit the building of a maritime fleet in its colonies. So Mexico was disallowed from having what you and I would call a merchant marine. Everything had to be on Spanish ships, which is one of the reasons why, how many times did you have the Manila galleon go through? Usually, at most, twice a year. Why? Because they wanted to control that trade. As opposed to, hey, whoever wants to go, go. There was no notion of free trade in the Spanish Empire in that respect. So Mexico did not have a navy to speak of with independence. Didn't have the money to build a navy for decades and so on. So its commercial ties with Asia, with the Pacific, went down the tubes in that respect. Income, of course, the other powers in the midst of all this, and that includes, of course, Britain and the Dutch. Keep in mind, the Dutch was a very powerful empire there for about 100 years, and they had tremendous presence in the Pacific and Asia and so on, then eventually the US. So by the time Mexico wants to get into the ball game, it's all over. Right? Everybody has carved out the spheres of influence, as we tend to call it in American textbooks and so on. And of course, Mexico's Navy and Merchant Marine, by the time Mexico, quote unquote, gets its act together, there's so many other powers that have so much more naval capacity and so on, that Mexico is just simply not a player to this day when it comes to shipping in that respect. It has a merchant marine, but it's very small, mostly coastal in that regard, because there are other companies that do all the international trade for Mexico. So Mexico's oil is usually put on ships from Canada or Liberia, and you all know why, right? Because of the licensing rules and this sort of thing. So to a large extent still, Mexico, that legacy is still with it in that regard.
And if I could just make a comment?
Yes, please.
I want to put in a plug. I recently saw a very good film, The Wind That Swept Mexico.
Yes.
And you're in that film.
Yes.
Great job.
We scripted that ahead of time. You have earned your $10. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about the kind of the immediate social or political impact of the war, if it led to a greater sense of nationalism and unity, or what kind of the initial reaction afterwards.
Okay, again, a short answer to a complicated question. There was no such thing as a Mexican nation in even 1850. The fact that you had Yucatan trying to declare its independence tells you something about that. There was no sense of being Mexican or Mexicaness, if you will. What the war against the United States did, though, was that it did stimulate a surge of nationalism in Mexico City and among the people of Mexico City. And in that respect, just like the United States and its foreign policy at times elicits a reactions from countries that unify the country because of our interventionism, all right? Like Cuba, just to take one example. The same thing happened in Mexico. And part of it had to do with how the United States troops and so on treated the Mexicans when they invaded Mexico. Josefina mentions it very briefly, and that is a bombardment of Veracruz. And the bombardment was completely random. There was no attempt to hit only, quote unquote, military targets and the like. So most of the damage was collateral damage, where thousands of Mexican civilians were hurt by the bombing, and of course many of them died as a consequence. So that was the message that people brought from Veracruz to Mexico City. Oh my God, you won't believe what the Americans are doing, and so on. And of course, a lot of the troops that the Army had at that time were anti-Catholic. This is one of the reasons why you have the St. Patrick's Brigade. When Winfield Scott gives his speech about the Catholics this and the Catholics that, and the Irish troops are saying, hello? All right? And they say, screw you. All right? And when they got their chance, they went over to the Mexican side. All right? Because for them, the issue of religion had a lot more, much more important than being an American patriot, if you will. So in that respect, the word coming from Puebla, and then the way that the Mexicans were treated at Veracruz, Puebla, and so on, Jalapa, which was another city on the way in of the Mexican army, American army, then the Mexicans were poised for the first time as being Mexicans against the United States. And when you go to the Museum of Interventionism, that aspect, if you will, is incarnated in the way in which the exhibit takes place. Right? There is no word, zero word about the desertion of the Indians from the Mexican army, for example. Right? It's this great nationalist moment. And in that sense, Mexican nationalism, there's a surge of that, but it's primarily local, primarily in Mexico City, and to some extent Veracruz, which was always, in a sense, the appendage of Mexico City anyway. It's the main port into the country. It continues to be that. So that Veracruz, Mexico City axis, if you will, becomes a core site of this surge of Mexican nationalism. But does that mean something to the people in Yucatan? No. Does it mean anything to the people in Nuevo León? Not really. Does it mean anything to the people in Oaxaca? No, etc. So Mexican nationalism has to wait, in a sense, for a full flowering until the Mexican Revolution. And that's when Mexican nationalism becomes a national movement. For a lot of different reasons, just simply communications are better. Connections, transportation systems are better. And in that sense, you have a much greater degree of quote-unquote unity. And again, the U.S. blunders 3 times in, again, provoking Mexican nationalism. All right? One is the role of Henry Lane Wilson in the murder of Madero, Francisco Madero. And then the U.S. Occupies Veracruz. Woodrow Wilson thinks he can control the Mexican Revolution. And all the Mexican revolutionary leaders, even those that hate each other, despite that, they tell Wilson to go screw off. Right? And Wilson said, well, I just wanted to help. So get the hell out. And then the Persian expedition, again, does the same thing. Right? Again, this is our sovereign country. You cross into our sovereign territory. I want Villa to be dead tomorrow too, all right? But we're going to do it. Get the hell out. In that respect. Denise, anybody else before I go back to Denise? I'm sorry.
I was watching the film to get ready for this, and they were saying that the Americans offered to let the civilians out of Veracruz.
To let what?
To let the civilians leave Veracruz before they started the bombardment,
Right.
but that they were just curious about.
They did that after the first 3 days of the shelling. There was a storm in between. They started shelling and then there was a storm. And then it came back that a lot of the people that were being killed were civilians. Boy, talk about a signal for me to say. That reminds me of those 1950s movies. Expect some kind of flying song. Anyway, there was a pause in the shelling of Veracruz, all right? I'll answer Jean's question without her presence in that respect. And so that's what happened. All right. Anyway, okay, Denise, last question, right? Because I only have till 10:30.
Yeah.
Oh, 2 more questions, real quick.
I kind of wanted to rewind to why Mexico didn't settle. I mean, was it because they were just so decentralized and in such a state of flux that they couldn't come to an agreement or a decision?
It's hard to
Was
let
it about pride?
Right? It's about pride. It's about pride. Look at all the people who have been foreclosed and stay in their homes.
Yeah.
They get eviction notices. I mean, it's a hard thing to give up. And the leadership in Mexico City to give up Texas was an indication of failure. Failure. We failed.
But I mean, at the same time, if they were so intent upon consolidation and centralization and keeping,
I agree. I agree. It doesn't make a lot of. And Herrera was, in fact, at the cusp, who was president at that time, to actually sign off. Okay, we give up Texas, sort of thing. And the Brits were saying, yes, yes, do it, yes, please, sort of thing. And then somebody leaked the information. Holy shit! They're selling all of Texas. And again, keep in mind the whole question of money. Who was going to control that money? Okay, $15 million in those days, that's a lot of money. Okay, where is the money going to go?
They weren't thinking.
They weren't thinking that way. I mean, you and I can say rationally, come on, all right? Instead of losing half of your territory, give up Texas. Who wants Texas anyway? All right, look what Texas has provided the United States. Right? Give it up. Sort of. I'm kidding. And let's put it this way: why are the Texans here? Right? We do. Anybody here from Texas? See? Even they don't want to be there.
Given what you said about the connection between the church and the caste, etc., it was a priest. Hidalgo was a priest.
Yeah. Right.
So could you briefly comment on how it was?
Well, first, Hidalgo was a priest, but then there are priests. That we know of, he had at least 12 children. So he was that kind of a priest. Secondly, he was exiled to this what? Backwoods little town. All right. And now, I don't know how many of you know the San Joaquin Valley very well. I'm from the San Joaquin Valley. All right. And I'm amazed at the number of people who don't know the thriving metropolis of Goshen, or Exodus, or Shafter, right? Where you literally get shafted if you go to Shafter, if you're assigned there. And in that sense, ask yourself, would I rather be teaching in the Bay Area or be teaching in a place like Delray, California? Now, how many of you have been to Delray? There's a good reason why you haven't been to Delray. Okay? Because if it was an attractive place, some of you would have been there. Right? But most of us avoid the San Joaquin Valley. We usually go up and down Interstate 5 or 101. Rarely does anybody go 99 anymore. And if they do, it's because they're lost. Or they have to go to Yosemite, and they have to go on 99, and as soon as they can, they get off at Merced and start going up toward Yosemite, sort of thing. Bakersfield has become a joke, right? Sort of thing. In that sense, that's where Hidalgo was sent out. So he gets there to this backwards little town, and this town is populated with mostly Indians, mestizos, people of mixed Indians, Spanish, European background, Afro-mestizos, African and mestizos, and so on. And these people are abused and mistreated and so on. And allegedly, he has an epiphany. Now, probably part of the epiphany is he was still seething with anger at the way he was treated. This guy had been a professor at one of the top religious schools, kind of like the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley, in San Nicolas in Michoacan. All right? And then he's thrown out because he has the audacity to say, well, the celibacy stuff? I don't think the celibacy stuff is really something we should believe in. All right? Look at my kids. So for those things and others, he's exiled out there. And allegedly he has this epiphany. I suspect some of it also was anger, right? Resentment. And so he feeds, if you will, that resentment into his flock, if you will. And so there is a conjunction of those kinds of attitudes and so on. So when Hidalgo hears about this political crisis, that the king in Mexico, in Spain, has been taken prisoner by Napoleon and so on, like everybody else, this is an opportunity, just like our students, when we have our substitutes in our classrooms, right, they try to get away with stuff, right? And that's what many people in what we now call Mexico did, including Hidalgo. But his constituency, if you will, was again not interested in differences between federalism and centralism and so on. They wanted redress and recourse from that long history of abuse, mistreatment, and the like. And they thought that the easiest way to do that is to wipe them out, as opposed to negotiating. Well, let's have agreements, let's have constitutions, let's have written documents and this sort of thing, just like Zapata, who immediately after the revolution, okay, revolution's over, give me the land. And Madero said, well, we have to do this the right way, we have to look at land titles, have a judge look at it, make sure everything is correct. And Zapata says, bullshit. Bullshit. I know where the lands are. I have the titles, all the way back to the days of the Spaniards and so on. I don't need a judge to tell me what is my land. And Madero said, well, Zapata, Emiliano, that we have to do it the democratic way, the procedural way, and so on. End of story. May Allah be with you.